Our first scripture reading today is from the lectionary, and it's Psalm 119. I noticed that on our pew Bibles, Psalm 119 is subtitled, The Glories of God's Law. I'll begin with verse 33. Teach me, O Lord, the way of your statutes, and I will observe it to the end. Give me understanding that I may keep your law and observe it with my whole heart. Lead me in the path of your commandments, for I delight in it. Turn my heart to your decrees and not to selfish gains. Turn my eyes from looking at vanities. Give me life in your ways. Confirm to your servant your promise, which is for those who fear you. Turn away the disgrace that I dread, for your ordinances are good. See, I have longed for your precepts. In your righteousness, give me life. The second reading is one I chose, and it is from Matthew 7. As I looked for these verses, I thumbed through Matthew 5, 6, and 7, and I was struck by how all of the verses in those chapters were spelled out in my Sunday school experience here in this church. All these familiar stories contained in one spot. I begin with chapter 7, verse 24. By the way, there just might be a hymn in here somewhere. Just saying. And Jesus said to the gathering, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like the wise man who built his house on rock. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon the house, but it did not fall because it had been founded on rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like the foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain fell, the floods came, the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell. And great was its fall. I grew up reading newspapers. My parents always subscribed to a paper, and until recent times, so did Dottie and I. But currently, I still skim through several different papers a week. And although I have discovered internet news, I still would rather read a real paper. I think I have printer's ink permanently embedded in my fingers. A few years ago, most papers ran articles about the status of religion in mainline churches today and visions for the next century. That was a very popular theme back in 2002, 2003, what will the future bring? There were lots of observations and commentary from both churches, ministers, parishioners, and the like. And a couple of themes developed that said that because, well, maybe our short attention spans, because of the short attention spans of today's members, the focus was on what churches needed to do to keep members for as long as possible. It was stated that many parishioners like to sample churches. Maybe try a church out here for a while, then go over there, maybe don't go anywhere for a while. And the commentary was all directed at what churches needed to do to keep people for as long as possible. Well, as a longtime member of one church, I thought there may be another side to the story. I can't argue with what was said, but rather what was left out. I would direct my comments to the parishioner, or would-be parishioner, as sort of an advertisement, if you will, for the advantages of establishing roots in one church. And of course, I mean this church. All I can do is give you several vignettes of my life in this church, one of which you've already heard. It's part of my story, but maybe that'll serve a purpose. So here it goes, or as Paul Harvey would have said, and now for the rest of the story. When I try to explain something, I often look for the simplest, most straightforward example that I can find. And today, I think I found it in a song. Dottie and I have satellite radio in our car, and if those of you who have that service, you may be aware there's an all Elvis station. XM19 on your dial, they play Elvis 24/7. They don't just remember Elvis, they never forgot him. On Sunday mornings from 8 to 10, there's Elvis Gospel. Here, Elvis is being true to his own roots of growing up in churches in Mississippi and Tennessee. It's a wonderful program, and we enjoy listening to it on our way to church. We are especially taken with the song, "I'm Working on the Building." Maybe some of you have heard of that song. It's been around a long time, been recorded by various artists. And there are several sets of lyrics, but Elvis's lyrics go like this. And no, I'm not going to sing this. That wouldn't be wise. I'm working on the building, not a building. It's a true foundation. I'm holding up the blood-stained banner for my Lord. Well, I never get tired of working on the building. I'm going up to heaven to get my reward. Well, you can't get any more straightforward or simple than that, can you? Remember those lyrics for a few minutes. Growing up in this church, I have lots of memories of childhood here, so let's start there. I think I was pre-kindergartners, remembering these names. My class consisted of at least 4 of us, Wendell Christoph, Marilyn Hausman, Peggy Hill, and myself. A year ahead was my cousin Galen Pletcher and David Davis. And a year behind were Tommy Davis and Joel Thurtell. And just ahead of us, just ever so slightly ahead of us, was Nancy DeRusha. We had some great times, didn't we, Nancy? Sunday school classes with Charlie Hausman. Confirmation class with Reverend Woon, where Galen and I received Bibles from our grandmother, Dora Pletcher. I still have mine. Red letter edition. I'm never going to give this one up. There were church youth group meetings, Pilgrim Fellowship. We had car washes, meetings, social events, dinners. Did I say car washes? Trips to Chicago, trips to Detroit overnight. It's the first time I'd ever been out of the state of Michigan. Wendell, Marilyn, and I graduated from high school together, and 2 years ago we went to our 50th reunion. But it's only been in the last few years that I realized how important all these early relationships were. Taken together, they help define who I am today as part of my identity. I still remember their names. And guess what? If my parents had been one of those described in that newspaper of moving around from church to church, I wouldn't have had any of these experiences. They're based on long-term relationships, not just a fleeting event or one experience. The newspaper articles never mention anything about that. When Dottie and I moved back to Michigan from Washington, D.C., well, back for me, new for her, I found myself on this board of trustees. And I quickly learned that the board ran the annual stewardship drive that was then held in November. The drive consisted of the proper buildup, an appropriate sermon on Stewardship Sunday, but then the congregation was asked to go home and await a visit from one of the members of the committee. The congregation would be given an opportunity to discuss the church, ask questions, and hopefully give that pledge card to the trustee member. Well, visits were made, comments and pledge cards collected, and after a few days, the trustees met to go over the comments that were received. Well, several of us had received comments about this church that were, shall we say, less than ideal. And those that were new to the procedure, such as myself, were worried that we're in trouble. This is really in trouble. Finally, a person with strong roots already established in this church spoke up. Ruth Thurtell. You know, Ruth began, I've heard most of these comments before. Different times, different situations, different ministers, different personnel. But I, Ruth, am a member of First Congregational Church of Lowell. There's that identity thing again. And I support and work on the mission of this church. The emphasis was on the church. Then Ruth followed with a last point that is going to be and will be so important to this church today. She said, I support and work on the mission of this church, which will go on forever. True story, completely true. I have never forgotten her comments. When someone, Ruth, has established strong roots in a church, one gains much perspective. Ruth was working on the building, a true foundation for her Lord. I will admit to you right now today that there have been times that I have left a church meeting here and gone home so mad and so upset that if you'd asked me at that very point, I would have said, I'm done. And yet here I am today speaking to you. Roots, they can be a powerful tool. Perspective, they can be a powerful tool, both with God, marriage, family relationships, and the like. Last June, a year ago June would have been, Chris gave a sermon on the lacrosse team. Some of you remember that? He had the 10 lacrosse sticks lined up in the front of the church and got 10 members of the congregation to come forward and each hold a lacrosse stick. Then he described each team's position, what their role was. He then asked each member to then, in turn, sit down. And he said that the lacrosse team, wouldn't perform as well if one or more of the parts were missing. I believe Jesse was the last man standing with a stick. Chris then related the lacrosse team to this church in building a team for Christ. The church needed all its members. Christ's team didn't work well if several parts were missing. We all needed to stick together. I loved that sermon. And as an aside, I told Chris a week or two later, you know, that sermon was so good that it made my all-time top 10 list for sermons. Now, I know Chris was pondering the comment, wondering what was the ulterior motive or something, but trust me, it wasn't any ulterior motive. There was none. The sermon was just that good. As I listened to that sermon that Sunday, I could only add one point. It takes time to build a lacrosse team. The team won't be successful overnight. It takes time energy, and responsibility on everyone's part to make it happen. The same is true with building a team for Christ. I believe we live in a modern society that is too impatient. We expect instant results, and when the results don't happen, we just drop whatever it is, move on to something else. Well, if one is committed to working on the building, results will happen. It just takes time. But remember, you never get tired of working on the building. A few years ago, one of those weekly news magazines, and I wished I could remember which one, ran a cover story on the great physicist Albert Einstein and how his theories would fit with religion. Well, as one who has a Bachelor of Science degree in applied physics, another story, and interested in religion, I look forward to reading the article. Well, unfortunately, my humble opinion, the article was a muddled mess. As difficult as it is to explain Einstein's special theory of relativity and that space-time continuum thingy, when religion was added to the mix, it was a bridge too far. However, within that article was this great story. And I've talked to you before, I've mentioned I collect stories, and there's always a disclaimer that what strikes me as humorous and on point maybe not strikes the listener that I'm telling the story to in the same manner. However, I have waited years for the proper time to tell this story. Bear with me for a minute. The Einstein family was by heritage Jewish. However, within the extended family, there were various degrees of observance with the Jewish religion, and Albert included. But in particular, Albert had an uncle who had decided that religion in general, and the Jewish religion in particular, was bunk. There is no God, he would explain to one and all. In fact, he was so adamant in these views that new members to the Einstein family were warned in advance, do not get Uncle started on religion. Nevertheless, several years go by, and one of the younger members of the Einstein family observes Uncle going into temple. Saw him do it more than once. So at the next family gathering, the young man told some of his contemporaries what he had seen, and together they march across the room to confront the old man. Uncle, they say, we have all heard your views that there is no God, and yet we know you're attending temple. Explain yourself. Well, the old man looked at the floor, looked up at the gathered, finally sighed and says, but one never knows. One never knows. Ladies and gentlemen, I am here today to tell you that as Uncle discovered, it is never too late to start building those roots. Never too late. In putting together this service, I realized that I have used and would use many descriptive phrases and words for roots in this church. I realize that these images and words are practically everywhere. You heard some Shannon this morning. Therefore, in closing, I thought I would be useful to just list them for you again. Roots in this church. Building, both noun and verb. Foundation. rock. Here's one: stability, nourishment, benefits to roots, memories, building lifelong relationships and experiences, identity, perspective, teamwork, personal growth, vision and goals, fellowship, and family. I'll wager that if you think about this, you can list many more. Why don't you give it a try? Amen.